Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Forbes senior contributor, Adam Minsky. Adam, I have had many debt ceiling conversations over the past few months, and I'm so excited to finally loop in our resident student loan expert to weigh in. So, as we know, the much talked about debt ceiling deal did come with some caveats regarding student loan payments and things like that. Can you talk about how student loans, student debts made it into the conversation here? Why were GOP lawmakers trying to use the debt ceiling to force President Biden to cancel his own student debt relief plan?
Yeah, I think House Republicans really wanted to use the prospect of raising the debt ceiling to extract concessions from the Biden administration and cut or gut a multitude of programs. In the debt ceiling bill that the House GOP passed a few weeks ago on a partisan basis, that bill would have completely repealed President Biden's one time student loan forgiveness plan and also reversed Biden's latest extension of the student loan pause, which advocates had warned could have catastrophic and dire consequences for millions of borrowers. So they really wanted to cut back the Biden administration student debt initiatives. What ended up making it into the final compromise is not as bad for borrowers as that initial bill was. Biden has managed to preserve his student loan forgiveness plan, still blocked by federal courts, and the Supreme Court still has to weigh in on it. But as of right now, the plan has not been repealed legislatively. And what it does do is it locks in the end of the student loan pause on the same timeline that the Biden administration had already been publicly announcing would happen. 60 days after June 30th is when the student loan pause will end.
Let's talk about the good news for borrowers first. This impacts close to 40 million borrowers to receive $10,000 or $20,000 in federal student loan forgiveness. And they must be breathing a sigh of relief that this is saved for now. But how was President Biden able to do this? Do you have any insight how he was able to salvage this staple of his presidency?
We don't know exactly what happened behind the scenes in closed door negotiations, but there were reports that there were some red lines for the administration. They did not want to repeal the signature legislative achievements, such as core elements of the Inflation Reduction Act or the bipartisan infrastructure bill, and his signature one time student loan forgiveness plan, which would wipe out up to $20,000 in federal student loan debt, was also a major policy victory for the administration if the Supreme Court allows it to proceed. So it sounds like that was a red line for the administration, and they did not want to give that up as part of any other concessions.
So this is saved for now, but is it saved for good?
That's the big question. So it does look like that Biden has managed to prevent a legislative repeal of his student loan forgiveness plan, but ultimately the fate of the plan is still in the hands of the Supreme Court. There are two legal challenges before the court. The court heard oral arguments back in February. A decision is expected sometime in June, could come any day, but should almost certainly arrive within the next few weeks. And ultimately, the court will decide whether or not this program can proceed or not. A lot of borrower advocacy groups and some progressives in Congress have urged the Biden administration to have a backup plan ready to go, just in case the court winds up striking down the program. But so far, at least publicly, top administration officials have not indicated that there is a backup plan in the works.
So if you're a borrower relying or waiting on that relief, you can rest easy for now, but still wait for June to see that final decision. Now, I do want to talk about some maybe not so good news for borrowers when it comes to this debt ceiling bill, and that is the student loan payment pause is officially being lifted. What can you tell us?
That's correct. So the Biden administration had previously said that the student loan payment pause would end either 60 days after June 30th or the date that the Supreme Court rules on the debt relief plan. What the debt ceiling bill does is it effectively codifies what the administration has already been saying publicly. Some might argue that's no big deal. The problem, however, is that it does remove the administration's ability to extend the relief again if the Supreme Court issues an adverse decision. And the administration has tied the student loan pause to the debt relief that's before the Supreme Court. The argument is that folks should be able to receive that debt relief before they're forced to restart their payments after over 3 years of the moratorium. So what the debt ceiling bill does is it prevents any further extension. Now, if there's a new emergency, a new crisis, the administration will be allowed to issue a new pause, and the debt ceiling bill does allow him to do that. But this does kind of set in stone that payments are going to restart later this summer, regardless of what happens with the Supreme Court.
Let's talk about just how big of a deal this is. Let's say the Supreme Court turns down President Biden's plan. Would he be able to count that as a crisis, or are borrowers just a little bit out of luck come June 30th?
Well, it can't just be any crisis. He issued the pause. Actually, originally, President Trump issued the pause under the HEROES Act of 2003, which allows the Education Department pretty broad authority to modify and waive certain rules and programs governing federal student loans in times of a national emergency. A Supreme Court decision striking down his debt relief plan is probably not going to be a national emergency as defined in the statute, whereas a pandemic, for instance, would be. So there would have to be some sort of new emergency to justify a new pause, given the statutory language for the debt ceiling bill.
You know, if I was sitting here as a borrower listening to you, I would think, this is a mixed bag. I've got some good news that President Biden's sweeping plan wasn't completely shot down just yet, but also that pause is over in about a month, so I would have to start paying soon. So how should borrowers feel, and what has the response been?
I think the response has been mixed, and I think it may ultimately come down to how the Supreme Court rules. I mean, certainly the Biden administration has managed to neutralize some of the biggest threats to borrowers in terms of what House Republicans were pushing for. If they had retroactively ended the pause based on Biden's most recent extension, not only could borrowers be forced back into repayment right now, but borrowers who received loan forgiveness credit during the last few months or had their loans discharged could have a reversal of that if those plans had gone through. And then the Supreme Court cases would ultimately be moot if that debt relief had been repealed legislatively. So some might argue that Biden managed to protect many borrowers from some of the worst possible outcomes. That being said, now his hands appear to be tied in terms of extending the student loan pause any further. And certainly, I think a lot of borrowers are going to be unhappy about restarting payments. And because it's been so long since many borrowers have had to pay, a lot of borrowers might be caught off guard by payments resuming, which the administration and advocacy groups have argued could lead to a spike in defaults.
Let's talk about that. Whenever you and I do one of these segments, I always ask you how borrowers should prepare. But that has been kind of up in the air because borrowers have been in limbo. Now we have a definitive, okay, the pause is officially ending. And people, as borrowers specifically, haven't been factoring this bill into their monthly payments now for 3 years. So what are some tips and tricks for borrowers to prepare come time for the payment pause to be ending?
Well, now is a great time to look at your loans. A lot of people have not even had to sign into their accounts for some time. A lot has changed in the last 3 years. Your servicer may have changed. You might not even remember what your payments were, what payment plan that you were on. So step one would be to figure out who's handling your loans and what your payments are expected to revert to once payments resume later this summer. Step two is figure out if you need to make any changes to make the payments more affordable or to benefit from certain other administration programs, such as the IDR account adjustment, which can accelerate some borrowers' progress towards eventual loan forgiveness. So folks might want to look at income-driven repayment plans, loan consolidation. What do you need to do to get that payment payment more manageable. Even for folks who are already on an income-driven plan, you might want to request a recalculation of your payments if your income has dropped since your last payment calculation. So best to start working on this now and not waiting until later in the summer. One of the big concerns that advocacy groups have raised is that loan servicing companies are going to be completely overwhelmed when 40 million borrowers simultaneously resume repayment. Call lines could be overwhelmed, payment processing could be delayed. So it's best to not wait, in my opinion, until June, July, or August. Well, tomorrow is June 1, so start doing it now. Don't wait until the last minute.
That's such good advice because I wouldn't think of those technical parts. So I definitely would be stuck on hold for an hour, coming down to crunch time if I had to make a payment. So Adam Minsky, per usual, thank you so much for the advice.
Thanks for having me.